All right, so if you have a water-cooled engine and you think it might be running hot, let's talk about some things to look for that might be helpful for you if you're on the side of the road. I know there's a lot of people getting back on the road now and traveling places because you can, right? So let's see if we can help you out. Later on in the video, if you stick around, I'll talk to you about doing some maintenance items to prevent your engine from getting hot. And if you stick around long enough, but we'll talk about what's happening if your engine is running hot right now. Basically, there's about 3 different major things that happen most of the time that make your engine overheat. Number 1 is you have a loss of pressure. So in other words, a lot of times it's a coolant leak. So sometimes if your radiator cap itself is bad, okay, and it's not holding pressure in the system, that will make your engine overheat. So you may not have a radiator cup that looks like that. You might have a regular standard one. I would not recommend taking it off while it's hot. Make sure you cool the engine off. Generally what I do if my engine's hot is I'll carefully take water and cool the engine and the radiator off. And if you can do that, that's helpful. Be careful. If you do too much water too fast, you could actually crack the engine block or crack the head. So, you know, keep that at your own risk, of course. So when you have a coolant leak, what happens is you get a loss of pressure. And if you understand about water boiling and coolant boiling, coolant has a higher boiling point when it's under pressure. So to make the engine stay cool, it needs to be under, typically between, as the old cars were like 7 pounds, up to the new cars are about 16 pounds, somewhere in there. And if it's not under pressure, what will happen is the coolant will boil inside the engine that you can't see. And when it's boiling, there's actually air pockets in there, so the heat is not able to transfer from the steel or aluminum to the coolant. Another thing that happens often is typically your water pump goes bad. So your water pump can go bad, the impeller is not turning properly, or it's leaking from that area, and that's another common issue to replace your water pump. I do that on a maintenance level. The other thing is if the coolant is not flowing through the engine properly, it's because your thermostat typically is plugged, or it could be even the radiator is plugged, but usually it's most common thing is the thermostat. So your most common things are your system is not pressurized properly, your water pump is not working, turning properly, or the thermostat is stuck closed. So after your engine's cooled and you can safely take the radiator cap off, you determine when that is. But what I usually will do is make sure that when the engine's running, that I get circulation from the engine. Sometimes you can do things like touch your lower or your upper hose, because what happens is the water or coolant goes in from the lower hose, goes in through the engine, goes back out through the upper hose and into the radiator. That's typically the flow. On this car, there's obviously a reservoir over here. There's all these different things. Those are bypass hoses, and there's other things like that. But the typical flow is from the lower radiator hose through the engine, back through the upper radiator hose through the radiator. So in this car, the upper radiator hose is pretty buried, but if I touch the upper radiator hose carefully while the engine's running, if I feel it's hot, more than likely it has flow going through there. And if I feel that it's cold and I know that my temperature gauge says it's hot, I probably have a stuck thermostat. Or on some of these cars, the impeller spins on the water pump and is not spinning properly. That's a Volkswagen issue. So you need to determine when your car is overheating. If it's overheating while at idle, the most common things are things like the radiator fan's not working. So let's talk about how the radiator fan circuit works. Every car can be a little bit different. Some cars, the radiator fans are actually controlled by the engine computer. But typically how they work is there is a temperature sensor somewhere on the car that when it's grounded, when the wire to that's grounded, it sends a signal to a relay. So you have a relay, and this car would be in here in the relay box, And then what it does is that relay turns on the fans, because the fans draw a lot more energy than if they had it hooked up without the relay. It would actually burn up the wiring. So that's basically what relays do, is they kind of take the load and move it to another place. So you could have one of those things being bad. So if your car's overheating while you're at a traffic light, but when you're driving on a road, it's not overheating, I would look to the radiator fans first and make sure that they're turning on when you're at idle. You might want to get out of the car while the temperature is at the proper height. Look at your fans, see if they're turning on, see if one of them's turning really slow. You could have a bad fan motor, or a bad relay, or a bad fan switch, which is basically a little temperature switch on the block somewhere, or on the fan. Sometimes it's on the radiator. Now, if it's overheating randomly and just all of a sudden it just goes up and it doesn't seem to want to cool off, first of all, make sure you get to the side of the road as quickly as possible. A lot of these cars run at right at the edge of being too hot, and the head can crack, or the head gasket can go bad, or the block can crack very quickly. So getting to the side of the road and getting it cooled off is very important. But if all of a sudden it just overheats and it's like random, first thing you do is check your coolant level. Make sure your coolant's still full. Again, safely, when it cool it off, whatever you need to do to pull that cap off to make sure it doesn't blow off into your face. Make sure that you get the engine nice and cool before you check it. Make sure the coolant's full. If the coolant's full most of the time and you don't have any leaks, it's going to be the thermostat. And you need to find out where your thermostat's located. Almost every car is different. Some of them are on the top radiator hose, some are on the bottom radiator hose, sometimes they're in a little chamber somewhere. So you want to go to the parts locator and find out where that thermostat's located, and replace it, and then test it again. Now let's say you're driving down the road and your engine is overheating while you're driving down the road, but at idle it doesn't run hot. The most common thing for that is the radiator's restricted. So what happens is when the radiator gets restricted, it's unable to get the proper amount of coolant flowing through it when you're going down the road, and that restriction will cause it to get not enough airflow through the coolant to cool it off enough when it goes back to the engine, and that's the most common thing for that. Okay, so this is a thermostat. I get several people all the time that say that you can run your car without the thermostat and it's no problem. Well, let me tell you a little bit different on that. It is really not a good idea. When you're in the morning time, your engine's running way too cold, your oil temperature's too low, and what happens is that causes engine wear, because you're basically running your car cold all the time. And then what happens if your thermostat is out and you're driving down the road at a higher RPM under a load? I've seen guys with videos out that show that it's sitting at idle, it doesn't make any difference. Well, that's not driving conditions. When you're driving down the road and you have no thermostat in your car, what happens is coolant goes through the engine and through the radiator too fast. It doesn't stay in the engine long enough to dissipate the heat from the engine into the coolant, and it doesn't stay in the radiator long enough to dissipate the coolant into the air to cool it off. So what happens is it just circulates through the engine and through the radiator too fast, and makes your engine get hotter and hotter and hotter, and eventually it'll overheat. Now you might say, well, it's not overheating. Well, it's not overheating. How do you know the actual temperature of the engine? Most of the time you're looking at something that doesn't tell you the actual temperature of the engine, and it's probably running hotter than it should be all the time when you're on the road. Not a good idea to run without a thermostat. It's only for a temporary solution. If you were to have a overheating problem and you're on the side of the road somewhere and you knew it was your thermostat, you know it was randomly just all of a sudden overheated, your system's full of coolant, and you didn't really know what it was, probably the thermostat got bad. And what you can do temporarily is take and break the thermostat right here and right here, and take the spring and this little valve out. And what that'll do is that'll give it enough restriction of flow so that it won't overheat as quickly. It's a temporary solution. Don't leave it that way. Get a thermostat, put it in the car, It is really important for your engine wear to have a thermostat in your engine. That's why engineers put them in there. It's funny that people think they're smarter than the engineers. These guys get paid a lot of money and do a lot of research and a lot of stuff, and they think for some reason they're smarter than those guys. It really, honestly, you're probably not going to be. All right, let's just say you've overheated on the side of the road. You determine there's a leak. You can't fix it right then, and you need to get somewhere to where it's safe or to work on it or whatever, and you have some water or coolant with you. Oh, real quick, I wanted to make sure I mentioned this, and I don't want to forget to. I've seen a lot of times where people actually put straight coolant. You should always have 50-50 mix in your car. And the 50-50, I always use distilled water or reverse osmosis water. Coolant by itself with no water mixed in it does not transfer the heat from the aluminum and steel to the coolant well enough. It has to have the water in it for it to do its job. So if you have straight coolant in your engine, another bad thing to have. Make sure you have that 50-50 mix. Really, it's very important. And using distilled water in your radiator will prevent all that alkali and stuff build up inside your radiator. So if you want your radiator to last a long time, you run distilled water or purified water in your radiator with your coolant. Okay, that's a very important thing. Another important thing is the type of coolant. Like in this car, it's G12 coolant. If you have a GM car and it says it requires DexCool, you need to make sure you're using DexCool coolant. You need to have the right coolant for your engine. So when you go to the auto parts store, make sure you get the proper coolant for your engine, because if you don't have the right one in there, it can cause wear to the seals and things like that. Like the water pump seal may wear out faster, things like that, and you may not end up getting the life out of things you are supposed to. Or you can cause corrosion in your engine from doing that. So if you want to maintain your car not to overheat, I rarely ever overheat in any of my cars, and one of the reasons is because I run distilled water in my radiator. That's number one. Another thing I do is depending on the year, make, and model of the car, you should always check with your manufacturer to make sure it's the proper time, is on a maintenance interval, I will replace my belt, my water pump, and my thermostat and put all new coolant in. So the only thing typically that will go wrong on the road in mine would be a coolant leak from a radiator hose, which is something typically, if you're on the road somewhere, you could actually fix. So let's get back to what I was saying. If you're on the road, you broke down, you ran all the coolant out of the car, you end up with a coolant leak. Let's talk about what you can do possibly to get yourself to the next town or wherever. And of course, be very careful. Do not let the engine overheat. If it overheats you again, you can ruin the engine. You can crack the block. You can crack the head. You can blow the head gasket. And those are very expensive items to replace. But again, if it's safe to do so, actually on this car right here, see this right here? I have a little brass T in there. There was originally a little plastic T in there, and I was up in the mountains and that T cracked. I didn't have anything to fix it with. So how did I get home? I was able to drive it home, and I'll show you how I did it. In my trunk, I always carry bottled water to drink, and I use that. And what I did is I carefully loosened up the radiator cap slowly, made sure that there was no pressure in the system. Of course, it was already leaked out because it was under pressure when that leaked out of there. I filled up the thing with water, and I kept filling it up until it was completely full. And then what I do is you had to prevent the engine from building up pressure. So what I did, I put this cap on just a couple little turns and left it like this. I'll show you. I just took it off here and I left it really loose to where I knew that it wouldn't seal. Okay, about like that. So the water wouldn't just trickle out of it, but it was just to where it wouldn't seal. And what that does is prevents the engine from building up pressure. Now it's going to boil over a little faster than it normally would, but it prevented it from building up pressure so that it wouldn't leak out of this T is fast. So if you have a really minor coolant leak, sometimes that will help you get to the next town. Fill up your radiator with that temporarily, leave the radiator cap loose, drive it to the next town, keep an eye on the temperature gauge. Of course, do that at your own risk, of course. But that's how I was able to do it, and that's basically a hypothetical of what you could do if you were thinking about hey, I've got to get to the next town, I don't have a tow truck, I don't have whatever, let me see if I can do this. Something you do at your own risk. That's what I've done many times before when I've had an actual problem with a coolant leak on the road. Now, if it's your water pump that's leaking, and especially if it's timing belt driven and you have an interference engine, really not a good idea to keep driving. It's a really good idea to stop. Water pumps can be one of those things that when it goes out, you just can't fix it on the road. You can't do a temporary repair to it. That's why I say replace those on a maintenance level. If you do that, it'll solve a lot of your problems on the road and keep you from having issues if you're over those miles. Like on this old Honda, changed that water pump at a maintenance level. Never had an overheating issue. I just did this car here. I keep that thing maintained. Brand new water pump, new timing belt, and a new thermostat. And make sure you get quality parts. Get quality name brand parts. Watch out for the cheaper parts stores, zone type stores, if you know what I mean. Those stores have some cheaper parts. I've had guys that actually got their brand new stuff and actually had a problem with the new part. So make sure you get a good name brand. GMB is a good brand for replacement. Another one I'm trying to think of, if you have a factory original part, if you have a German car, make sure it's a German water pump. You know, try and stick with good quality brands. Anyways, those are some of the basic things you can look for on your car when it's overheating, how to kind of diagnose it. You know, think about how the system works. If you're driving down the road and the coolant's going through the system, what would happen if it was restricted, and would that cause the engine to overheat? If you kind of think about it from a logic standpoint and just kind of think about what it's doing, when it's doing it, if it's overheating when it's at idle, or if it's overheating or running hot when it's at cruise. At idle, remember, that's probably going to be something to do with the fans, or it could be, you know, some other things. If it's going down the road and you don't have any coolant leaks and your thermostat's new, probably you're going to have a issue with the radiator. But sometimes it takes replacing a couple of items to be able to figure it out. So sometimes you're going to have to replace the thermostat and then drive it a bit. You know, so to eliminate the fact that the thermostat could be randomly sticking. So that's a common thing that happens. And so I always say, well, replace the thermostat, drive it for a little bit, see if it overheats again. Watch the fans, see if they're turning on. You know, be observant about your car. Roll the window down if it's getting hot, or it's starting to get hot, and you listen for those fans. Get out and look at it. You know, those are the type of things to do. And if it's none of the above, and you've replaced all the other items, it could be things like your head gasket. Now, if your head gasket's blown, a lot of times when you'll take the radiator cap off, you'll see pressure coming out of there. Or another thing to do is take it off and smell it. If it smells like burnt coffee, your head gasket's probably blown. You can get a head testing kit and test it, but more than likely, if it smells like burnt coffee, it's blown. So you're probably going to have to replace it, or it could be a cracked head as well. You know, usually the cracked heads come with the head gasket. So some engines just crack the head right away, some don't ever. You know, you can get it super hot and it won't crack the head. But I've seen some pretty crazy things. I've actually seen where somebody drove it so far that there was grooves in the head from the water going into the cylinder for so long. You know, I mean, listen, if your car's overheating, you got to fix it right away. You can't keep driving it. All right. So anyway, hopefully that helps you out and you can figure out your way through some of your problems. I'll talk to you in the next video. Please like, share, and subscribe.